Is there any evidence for Christianity? What counts as evidence? How much evidence do we have? All this and more today on the Legati Christi podcast. Welcome to the Legati Christi podcast. I'm your host, David W. Gilmore, and today we're going to look at one of the most helpful set of tools I have ever come across for evaluating truth claims, especially what Christianity has to say. And this is by thinking of myself as a detective. Now, this paradigm isn't something that I came up with on my own. All the credit goes to J. Warner Wallace, who has been one of the most impactful people in the way that I think through things, especially events from the past. Wallace is a former cold case homicide detective here in Los Angeles, and he developed a set of skills as a detective that helped him evaluate things like eyewitness statements and like truth claims being made by suspects and a whole host of other things. Thinking like a detective also puts us in the mindset to talk to our non-believing friends because, just like a prosecuting attorney in a trial, we need to evaluate the evidence that we have before us and give a compelling account for what the evidence has to say to the jury. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about evidence. We're going to talk about how we can use multiple pieces of evidence to make our case. And we're also going to give some jury instructions to help evaluate the evidence that's in front of us. Now, when I talk to others about the truth of the Christian worldview, I frequently hear this demand: I need evidence. That's what people will say. And let me start by saying this is a good requirement. We should hold our views based on reason and evidence. When we went through all of the common logical fallacies a little bit ago, I said that it's wrong to think that something is true purely on the fact that so-and-so said it. We don't want to just be spitting party lines and repeating headlines that we see. We want to hold our views because of solid evidence and good reasons. But is there evidence for what Christians believe? I mean, we're talking about believing in forces largely unseen and in events that happened over 2,000 years ago. So what kind of evidence do we have for all of that? Now, so let me start off with a real-world story to set the stage. On May 25th, 1978, a suspicious package was found in a parking lot of Northwestern University. When a security guard examined the package, it exploded, and that package damaged his hand. And this bomb was just the start. This was the first one in a chain of 16 others that terrorized the country from 1978 until 1995. This is, of course, the famous Unabomber case, and he would only be seen planting a device once out of these 16 devices. And when they saw him, he was wearing a large aviator glasses and a hood, which obscured most of his identity. Most of his devices were sent through the mail. And he used painstaking efforts to make sure that there weren't any traceable evidence like hairs or fibers or fingerprints. There was none of that kind of stuff. There was no DNA found, which is kind of what we expect to be necessary to convict people these days. And to make it even worse, the explosive devices were varied, and the targets had nothing in common. And it wasn't until the killer released his 35,000-word manifesto that the case was able to be solved. Using the language in the letter, the investigators were able to determine the gender, age, ethnicity, and the area where the suspect grew up. This helped them to form a profile of the Unabomber, and once they had a sample writing from a known source, they were able to catch this guy. So notice, in this case, there was only one eyewitness for a total of 16 events. There was no DNA, there's no fingerprints, and no video footage. This entire case was made from written words. Now, anytime that we engage with someone in a discussion, we need to make sure that we're on the same page about the definitions that we use. In this case, when people say they need evidence, we need to understand what they mean by that word. What do you consider evidence? Now, we all know what evidence is in general, but the point of this question is more along the lines of what does that person think counts as evidence? What kind of evidence are they looking for? Now, normally when I ask someone what they mean by evidence, they're going to add some kind of a term like empirical in there somewhere. And by empirical, what they mean is testable or repeatable or reproducible in a lab. These are parts of the scientific method, and we've been trained from the first day that we enter school that this is the best way that we can come to knowledge. So the mindset here is that if it can't be tested or repeated, it can't be relied upon. But if you ask a police detective like J. Warner Wallace what counts as evidence, his definition is pretty simple. Everything counts as evidence. What someone said, what they could have said but didn't, how they said something, their body language, where they were, where they could have been, or where they should have been, but they weren't, past interactions with the victim, all of those things can be used as evidence by a detective trying to solve a crime. And most of that type of evidence isn't testable in a lab or repeatable most of the time. Now, in a courtroom, there are two categories of evidence. The first is direct evidence. The only thing considered direct evidence is eyewitness testimony. Only one person ever saw Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, set a bomb in 17 years of activity, and this may have been enough to convict him on one charge, but not all 16. The second type of evidence is indirect evidence, and this is everything else. Another term for this type of evidence is circumstantial evidence. In the Unabomber case, this was the letter, the words in the letter, the handwriting of the letter, and the second set of letters that was given to the investigators by Kaczynski's brother for comparison. And all the stuff that they found in his shack were all common household chemicals and items, none of which would have raised any suspicion just on their own. Now, for some reason, our society has developed a bit of mistrust when it comes to this word circumstantial. We have this impression that indirect and circumstantial evidence is less valuable from eyewitness testimony. But as Wallace points out frequently, the jury instructions on evidence in California are very clear. Both types of evidences have the same value. In the jury instructions in California, it says, as far as the law is concerned, it makes no difference whether evidence is direct or indirect. You may choose to believe or disbelieve either kind. Whether it is direct or indirect, you should give every piece of evidence whatever weight you think that it deserves. Both eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence can say the same thing. Let's say we have someone tell us it was raining outside. That is a direct statement. It was raining outside. Now let's say we find next to the door a pair of boots, and they're wet. This doesn't tell us anything on its own. All it tells us is that the boots encountered water in one way or another. With this piece alone, we couldn't know if the boots got wet because someone walked through a puddle, or if they washed something off of their boots because they were dirty, or that it was raining outside. Let's say next to the boots, though, we find an umbrella, and it's wet too. There are a few reasons that the umbrella could be wet, but the most reasonable explanation is that it was raining outside. One of the hard parts about making circumstantial cases is the evidence doesn't talk to us. We can't ask that piece of evidence questions like, why are you here? We have to use deductive reasoning to determine the best explanation for why these particular pieces of evidence are present. But sometimes the fact that the evidence can't talk actually helps, because as any detective will tell you, witnesses lie, or they get things wrong. Now, not all of them, of course, but some of them do because of relationships to the suspect or the victim or feelings about certain situations. In the case of the Zodiac Killer, which is one of the most famous unsolved cases in American history, the police had driven right by the guy who was likely the killer, but they ignored him because they were told that the suspect was black and this guy they saw walking away from the scene of the crime was white. Witnesses get it wrong sometimes. Some people will insist that circumstantial evidence isn't as valuable as eyewitness testimony. In another talk on the nature of evidence, Wallace lets us know that 85% of cases are solved with circumstantial evidence. Also, if we require the ability to interview eyewitnesses to an event, then we couldn't do history. There is no one around for us to interview in regards to things like the Civil War, or the Declaration of Independence, or the time when dinosaurs roamed the earth. In order to do history, we have to look at indirect evidence, things that were written down, where people were when these events occurred, and in the case of the dinosaurs, we have to look at the fossil record to try to determine what was going on. None of these things is direct evidence. We can't interview the eyewitnesses. We can't even interview the people who interviewed the eyewitnesses. Events like crimes, or the beginning of the universe, or the beginning of life, or any other event from history, these are all unique points in time. Several factors came together at that point in time together in a way to cause or explain a certain event. These events cannot be recreated in a lab in their entirety. We can get some clues from our knowledge gained through science and through experimentation, but we can't get all of it. We can try to recreate models to explain what happened, but we won't get the whole picture. For example, if a dead body is found in the woods, we can determine how long it's been there because science helps us to understand the rate of decay. We can also determine where the body may have been, because maybe we found some dirt under the fingernails. We might even be able to determine who was been around the body before they died, because there may be DNA evidence present. And we'll likely be able to determine their cause of death based on the type of injuries that they sustained or whatever. Now, all of these things can come from knowledge that we've gained in the lab, but the lab can't tell you why the body is there and not somewhere else, or why the person was murdered in the first place. If the investigation does determine that the person was murdered, the lab can't give you the reason that they were murdered. That requires a different kind of evidence that isn't necessarily physical or empirical or reproducible in a lab setting. Trying to make the case for the Christian worldview, or any other worldview for that matter, requires evidence to show why we believe what we believe to be true. The good news is that Christianity is based on a historical event that has been well documented and is supported by multiple pieces of eyewitness testimony and indirect evidence. The eyewitnesses documented what they observed. And just like with the Unabomber's manifesto, we can learn a great deal from the words that they used and the words that they didn't use. We can examine the series of events to see what happened. Based on the language that they used, we can tell where the witnesses came from. We can tell what type of education they had. And we can tell when they might have written the statements that we have. We can also use indirect evidence to determine how the universe came into existence. We don't get the benefit of eyewitness testimony there, but a testimony of sorts has been left behind for us to uncover. The same can be said for the creation of life, and even whether or not God exists. Requiring evidence for a position you hold is a great thing. We should not believe things that go against what the evidence shows us, but we also have to understand what counts as evidence. Direct observation is great when you have it. However, we can still learn about historical events and the nature of reality by other types of evidence. Law enforcement uses indirect circumstantial evidence frequently to solve cases, and we can do the same thing as we examine the Christian worldview to see if it's true or not. Now, when making the case for a particular worldview, there is certain evidence that we see in the reality that requires an explanation. For example, the universe is not eternal. It began to exist. But why did it come into existence at all? At some point, life began. How and why? We all have a sense that the world isn't the way that it ought to be. But what is the basis for morality? How do we best explain various historical events? These questions are our evidence. We see these things in reality, and this is our evidence that requires an explanation. These are the things that we found at the crime scene of reality, and we need to determine which worldview offers the best explanation for all of this evidence that we've just found. We just got done talking about what counts as evidence. As we're about to see, though, cases aren't usually made based on a single eyewitness testimony or the proverbial smoking gun alone. If you want a case to stand up in a courtroom, you have to make your case with cumulative evidence. Let's look at another crime as an illustration. Let's say that in your local metropolitan area, a young woman named Lori was murdered in her home. When the detectives arrived, they noted several things. First, her cause of death appeared to be blunt force trauma to the head with a small item. During their investigation, let's say they find a set of women's Callaway golf clubs in the garage, and they notice that the 5-iron is missing. When they examined the doors and windows, there appeared to be no forced entry. Right next to the body, they also found a partial size 11 boot print from a pair of Wolverine boots. And after talking to the neighbors tell the investigators that they remember seeing a blue El Camino pull away from the house around the time of death. Not having a suspect yet, the detectives start canvassing the places where Lori used to frequent. So because she has a fact of golf clubs in the garage, and it looked like that she'd used them pretty regularly, they start checking out local golf courses. They know that she golfs a lot, and they discovered that she used to play golf at a local golf course a lot. And after interviewing some people, they found out that the maintenance guy at this particular golf course drives a dark blue El Camino. Now, El Caminos aren't rare even in 2026. I still see them every once in a while here in Los Angeles, but there aren't many of them around anymore, and certainly not dark blue ones. But just because the guy owns a dark blue El Camino, that doesn't make him a killer. But the cops start paying more attention to this guy. So they go interview Ron, and they develop a case, and they go to search his apartment, and they pay him a visit. And in his apartment, they find a woman's Callaway 5-iron hidden under his bed. And the club smells like bleach, as if someone tried to clean it. Ron also happened to own a pair of size 11 Wolverine work boots. And they found a t-shirt that had been soaked in bleach in his trash can. Based on all this cumulative evidence, they were able to arrest Ron for the murder of Lori. Now, in this theoretical case above, not one piece of evidence could have convicted Ron on its own. El Caminos aren't rare. There might be several in any given city. Ron works at a golf course, so it wouldn't be out of place for him to have clubs at his home. And size 11 Wolverines are pretty common. You put any of these items in front of a jury on their own, and they couldn't have convicted Ron. But put all of these pieces of evidence in front of the court as a group, and either Ron is just really unlucky, or the best explanation for all these numerous pieces of evidence is that Ron is the killer. Another thing that makes help the case in front of a jury is having a variety of different types of evidence. Having just physical evidence is great, but when you add on other types, like the suspect's mental state, or having a motive, or he had the opportunity to commit this crime, it makes the case all that more convincing. Different kinds of evidence also make a case stronger because they can corroborate other evidence. In other words, different types of evidence back up the story that the other evidence tells. For example, if a store clerk says he was held up at gunpoint by a suspect, the suspect's handprint found on the counter doesn't tell the detectives if he had a gun and tried to rob the guy, only that he was there in the store like 100 other people that day. But if the security camera picked up a suspect with a gun and showed the suspect put his hand where the detectives found a handprint, those pieces of evidence corroborate the eyewitness testimony of the store clerk. They back up what he had said. In our example of the rain earlier, if an eyewitness says it was raining outside, we may not trust them just based on the words that they say. But if we find the wet boots and the wet umbrella next to the door, those pieces of circumstantial evidence back up the eyewitness testimony of it was raining outside. When jurors are given their instructions, the standard of conviction is beyond a reasonable doubt. They aren't told beyond a possible doubt, because anything is possible. Is it possible that given enough time, 1,000 monkeys with 1,000 typewriters might eventually write Hamlet? Sure, it's possible. But if you come across a copy of Hamlet on a deserted island, you wouldn't think that a monkey wrote it and put it there. You would think that another person must have written it. You'd think that another person was there before you and dropped it. That's the reasonable explanation. Now, in our case above with Lori, we can come up with a lot of possible explanations for the evidence that detectives discovered in Ron's apartment. It's possible that the suspect had the victim's golf club because he was fixing it for her. But why would someone working on a golf club clean it with bleach and then hide it under the bed? Why wouldn't it be on a workbench or something? It's also possible that the suspect went to the house and found the victim already dead. But then, why didn't he call for help? And why did he destroy any blood evidence with bleach? See, we can find individual possibilities for the evidence we've discovered to try and explain away the individual details. This would make the suspect just some incredibly unlucky guy. But it's not the reasonable conclusion. The reasonable conclusion is that he did it. When murder cases go to trial, the prosecution is going to try to attempt to answer several questions to get to the whodunit. Who is the victim? Where is the body? How did the victim die? Why did the victim die? When was the murder committed? Can the suspect be put in the right place at the right time to commit this murder? The more of these questions that get answered, the better. But not all questions need to be answered before the jury can come to a conclusion. If we think of a puzzle, we can usually have some missing pieces and still figure out what the picture is on the puzzle. Murderers can still be found guilty without a body or a motive. Not all of the questions need to be answered before the jury can come to a conclusion. The other thing to remember is that you don't have to be an expert or have special education in order to be a juror. In fact, jurors are made up of common people from all walks of life, like grandmas and plumbers and mail carriers and garbage collectors, and they're more than capable of reviewing the facts in a case to determine the verdict. We presume that our peers have common sense, and common sense goes a long way in these cases. In fact, the California jury instructions tell the jurors to use their common sense when deciding if someone's testimony is true or false. Jurors don't need a high level of education to qualify as jurors. That would completely defeat the idea of how juries are formed. Now, from here on out, most of the things that we're going to be talking about on this podcast is evidence for the Christian worldview. We'll be examining eyewitness statements and pieces of physical evidence. Philosophical arguments also count as evidence because they're things that exist in reality. That's going back to the why is there so much evil in the world, or how did we get here, or how did things begin? Those are all considered pieces of evidence. Here's the thing, though. There is no single argument or fact or piece of evidence that proves Christianity to be true. There's no smoking gun. For example, many atheists believe that they have a possibility for how we got morality that doesn't include God. They think that our morals developed over time through some kind of an evolutionary process, and we develop these morals because they help societies thrive. Of course, the theistic argument says that objective moral law has to come from an objective lawgiver outside of humanity. But other pieces of evidence help us form the picture of our suspect. Can the same worldview explain why we have objective moral laws and how and why the universe came into existence from nothing? These are two different pieces and types of evidence. One, we have morality, and one, we have the physical world. And why does life exist? And how do we explain the historical events like the life of Jesus of Nazareth? You have to examine all of these things. These are all pieces of evidence, and your worldview has to be the best explanation for all of these pieces of evidence. The conclusions that we come to based on our evidence also has to be reasonable. Is it more reasonable to think that the universe came into existence via an independent cause outside of the universe, or that it somehow created itself? Is it more reasonable to think that some proteins came together in a puddle of mud and somehow randomly formed the most complicated and information-packed bundle of code ever developed, meaning DNA? Or is it more reasonable to think that this mass of complex information requires intelligence to create it? Is it more reasonable to believe that over 500 people had a group hallucination of Jesus of Nazareth after he died, or that they actually saw a living, breathing person? Remember, anything is possible, but we need to get behind what is most reasonable. The case for Christianity also contains different types of evidence that help to corroborate what other pieces tell us. We find cosmological, biological, historical, and other types of evidence that tend to back each other up and bring this picture of reality into better focus. While trying to put together the picture puzzle of reality, we may not have all the pieces. We may not get all of our questions answered. But we don't need to wait for all of the pieces to fit into place. If we've lost the puzzle piece that adds more leaves to the tree of our picture, we can clearly see that the thing in the picture is a tree without having every single leaf in the picture. In the same way, we can make a decision with the evidence that we have on why things are the way they are. We can and should keep striving for a deeper understanding of the universe around us. But we don't need to have every single scientific riddle solved before we can come to a reasonable conclusion about reality. Finally, everyday people like you and me are completely capable of being jurors in this case. We don't need to have multiple degrees and wear lab coats. We can learn the fundamentals of various topics and gain enough knowledge to come to a conclusion on our own. Also, our common sense can take us a really long way. If we're walking in the woods and we come across a baseball cap, common sense tells us that it has an explanation for why it's there, and it probably didn't just grow on the ground. We don't need to understand the baseball cap manufacturing process in order to come to that conclusion, because we know enough about baseball caps and enough about biology to know that baseball caps don't grow on the ground. As we examine the evidence for reality, we'll see that there is not one smoking gun in this case. But we can look at the evidence collectively and come to a reasonable conclusion on who our suspect is. We may not get all of our questions answered. We may not understand the motives behind what happened. But every one of us can sit on this jury, needs to sit on this jury, and come to a reasonable verdict on why things are the way that they are. So there you have it, a brief introduction into evidence, what counts as evidence, and how we need to evaluate all the evidence that we find in our proverbial crime scene. evaluating this evidence is going to help us to build a profile of our suspect. And by suspect here, I'm talking about worldview, right? I hope that this helps you as we finally get started looking at the evidence, and I'll see you next time right here on the Legati Christi podcast.